Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, SSH Discover Secrets to Governing an Unknown Access Gap. ISACA and SSH Communication Security have partnered in an effort to bring visibility to an unknown access gap around SSH keys. We are pleased to bring you this guidance as it has been compiled with input from an audit and compliance practitioners, industry experts, and SSH Communication Security, all in order to help the audit community be able to identify potential risks to their own organizations and to provide information as to how audit professionals can take action to address assurance considerations. As outlined in the guidance, SSH keys are everywhere in today's enterprises, and they aren't just an IT issue anymore. Many organizations are unknowingly putting themselves at risk of not properly managing SSH keys, and when combined with compliance regulations such as GDPR, SOX, or PCI, for example, the risk can easily be compounded. So in today's session, in this webinar, you'll be able to learn more about the background and history of SSH keys, the relationship between SSH keys and the access they provide, key areas to consider when evaluating SSH key usage as it relates to impact and controls, and how to assess risks associated with unmanaged SSH keys. And at the end, you should be able to walk away with best practice control implementations to ensure continuous compliance is in place for your organization. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this informative webinar. First, we have Ed Moyle, who is currently Director of Thought Leadership and Research for ISACA. Prior to joining ISACA, Ed was Senior Security Strategist with Savvis and the founding partner of the analyst firm Security Curve. In his 20 years in information security, Ed has held numerous positions, including Senior Manager with CTG's Global Security Practice, Vice President and Information Security Officer for Merrill Lynch Investment Managers, and Senior Security Analyst with Trinitech. Ed is co-author of Cryptographic Libraries for Developers and frequent contributor to the information security industry as an author, public speaker, and analyst. And we also have our resident compliance expert, Fouad Khalil, who is the VP of Compliance here at SSH Communication Security. He has extensive experience in the technology space with more than 25 years spanning disciplines in software development, IT support, program and project management, and most recently, IT security and compliance management. Mr. Khalil has held several positions within the technology sector during his career, including network, system and database administration, software programming, system, software, and GUI design, project and product development, solution implementation, and much more. With all that, it is now my pleasure to turn it over to you. Gentlemen, please take it away.
Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar. And thank you for the great introduction. I really appreciate that. Ed and I are shaking our heads saying this is good stuff. With that said, let me just remind you of what Ruben alluded to for the agenda today. We're going to highlight a little bit on the history and the background of SSH keys, highlight the fact that we are concerned about the data. So any control, any thought, any protection we put around SSH keys is to protect what's important, and it's your data. We're going to dive into what the gap really looks like when you're talking SSH keys. Then I'll transition this to my colleague, Ed, to talk about the guidance and what highlights it brings forward from an assurance considerations. He will walk through the guidance, and then we will open it up for Q&A. All right, let's take a look back, a little bit of history. And some of these are going to be easy for some of you to remember. Some of you probably were not around when some of these happened, but these are some of the big names of breaches. These things are happening every day. I mean, MySpace happened with 390 million records, TJ Maxx, 94 million records, Anthem had 80 million, US voter database, 191 million records, JP Morgan Chase, 76 million. I mean, we're talking big, crazy numbers here. Heartland, 130 million records. Target had its famous 70 million records. Friend Finder Network, 412 million records. Some people had a lot of explaining to do. And then Yahoo is 500 million records. So the numbers are scary, but they're real. In 2016, we reported 1,093 breaches. That's a 40% jump over 2015. And I'm sure when we wrap up to 2017, we're going to see a very similar hike in breaches. To sum that up a little bit, we bring up the slide to show you that since 2013, we've had over 9 billion data records breached. So if you slice that up, that's 5.2 million every day. 218,000 every hour, 3,600 every minute, and every click of a second, 61 records. This is really scary information, and that is why we need to stay on top of this control environment and make sure that everything is strengthened, every control is efficient. With that said, we're going to bring up our first polling question for the webinar.
Excellent, Fouad. Let me launch that so everyone can see that. So the first polling question for everyone today is, and this is an interactive part of today's webinar, so we'd ask you to please answer this poll. What do you think constitutes important data? There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different options for you to select from, and we'd ask that now, as a participant, an active participant, that you please select the one that you think is best. I'll give you about 10 seconds. All right, I'll close the poll, and then I'll share the results with everyone. And looking at the results there, Fouad and Ed, you can see those. 96 of the respondents said all of the above.
This is what we expected. This hit the nail on the head exactly, because everything that we listed is considered protected data. To be honest with you, my approach has been, when I'm engaged in trying to do risk assessment and data mapping, we focus on what really is not protected. It's an easier approach than focus on what's protected. So good job, and love the number being 96%. Yeah. All right, let's move on. So what constitutes important data? As I mentioned earlier, it's everything you can think of, and some of the things that were in the polling question plus some: social security numbers, bank data, credit card numbers, date of birth, intellectual property, audit findings, source code, PHI or ePHI for protected health information. And thank you, GDPR, we included now IP addresses as well as cookies. So everything is important, and we need to make sure that everything is protected. Now, when you keep that thought in mind and you consider what's protected, I'm going to portray a known versus threat picture here, hopefully to deliver a message that we all need to be aware of. When you think about the norm, as professionals in our security, compliance, privacy, governance, we have enough to worry about on a day in and day out basis to make sure that we have authorized access to protected data from end users, from system administrators, our vendors that are coming from all over the place, and of course, automated processes that access our data for various reasons. That alone is a nightmare to maintain on a normal basis. Now, if you blend in the threats, you start thinking about things beyond our control, not the norm, where the credentials are broken, the exploits are being leveraged, the hardware backdoors are open, treason inside a threat, stolen credentials. So any way you look at it, protected data is at risk. So we're hoping that we need to help you make sure that you have efficient controls in the normal day to allow you to focus more on the threat and be more ready for that type of attacks. So what is the gap that we're talking about today? Let me give you a little bit of background. SSH is a protocol for securely transmitting data. It was invented by Tauti Ilonen, who was a student at the University of Helsinki in Finland. He wanted a secure mechanism to transfer data or communicate from point A to point B. It was developed in the mid-90s. SSH protocol technology is used in approximately 90% of corporate data centers. It's everywhere. It's widely used for automated machine-to-machine processes, things like your backup processes or the maintenance or performance monitoring and the like. The deployments of SSH keys never got the deserved attention. It came bundled, it got rolled out, and is being used. And of course, it never required a purchasing decision. That is one control auditors love to have, because this way they can track what's in and out coming into your infrastructure. And hence why I like to call it the dark side. For those of you Star Wars fans, I'm not referring to that, but you can if you'd like. So looking at SSH keys, it runs on everything within your environment, be it a Mac, Linux, Unix, VMware, AWS, Red Hat, GitHub, and the story really goes on. And with last year's announcement, in 2016, with the rise of Azure, SSH is deployed and used within the Microsoft environment. So when in doubt, I guarantee you SSH is being used within your production environment at some form or at some point. We all talk about identity and access management, IAM. I like to bring up this definition just because I like it and I think it's a unique one at hand, simply because IAM is a security discipline that enables the right individuals to access the right resources at the right times for the right reasons. I don't know about you, Ed, but I've never seen so many rights in one sentence. And to have a control environment to meet all those rights is close to impossible. So when people think about their access, I'd like to present you with a formula that SSH keys, along with your credentials and what constitutes access in your environment, this is a complete formula reflecting access into your environment. If you're only concerned about credentials and access alone, which most auditors have been looking at over the years, and SSH keys is not included, then you're missing a big piece of this formula. Now, so what does SSH have to do with access? How about we find out? For a bank, we worked with a major bank for quite some time, and at the point when we reached their 10,000 Unix host mark there, this is the data that we stumbled on, which was very jaw-dropping, shocking type of data. They had 1.5 million application keys granting access, 70,000 database administrator keys, and 70,000 system administrator keys granting access. 7,000 monitoring keys granting access. That goes back to your automated processes that are running monitoring stuff, and they're granting access. They had up to 1 billion authentication keys per year granting access. Scary numbers. And the worst part of it all is majority of the access is obsolete. Now, if you look at this, Ed, and you think about it, if I'm about to audit and select sample-based auditors, where am I going to start? Give me that 1 billion transaction source file, and I'm going to pick 10%. All right, that's a joke among auditors here. All right, the reason we have controls is to make sure that things are effective. But a lot of times, we tend to circumvent the control simply because it gets the job quicker. 9 out of 10 is not malicious intent. So I love to bring this picture up where we have an entrance to a facility with a gate. The gate is on purpose there to track the in and out, who's coming in and out of the facility. But as you can see, it's easier just to go around that gate. And that's the same approach when people think about the use of SSH keys. It's a privileged access tool that allows them to get the job quicker, sooner, without any slowdowns. Again, not typically for malicious intent, but if something goes wrong, it's very hard to investigate or look into that. I'm going to highlight that a little bit later. Taking a subset of that production environment for that bank that I mentioned earlier with all those crazy numbers, we took a snapshot of subset of the production, and what you see in the middle is their production environment. This spider web shows all the connections into their environment. It shows miscellaneous connections, unknowns, development, production, QA, disaster recovery, management having direct access to production. And the worst case of that scenario, 10% of those were coming in as root level from unknown sources. So for those of you in the audit, privacy, and security, if I tell you 10% of connections going to production are coming in encrypted root level from somewhere you don't know, I think we need to take some action to fix that. Apologies, let me just try this. Okay. One of the things I'd like to highlight from a breach perspective is the Sony breach. This is one of the breaches that stood out when it comes to SSH keys compromise. The hackers took over the credentials of one administrator, and once they went into that environment, they were able to generate keys from one server to the next, and in short time, they had total control over the Sony environment. And that's simply because the SSH key environment was not hardened, was not governed, was not tracked, was not inventoried, and the like. This is a great time for our polling question number 2 for this webinar.
Excellent. Thank you, Fouad. So to keep everyone on their toes and to get them involved, we have a second question here. Have you audited or assessed SSH key-based access in your organization? Please pick the answer that best fits your organization or enterprise. And then we will show the results here in just a few seconds as to how everyone answered. It's an interesting split coming up here, I see, as I see the assessment coming in before everyone else. Okay, I think we've seen a slowdown in the number of votes, although it's still coming in. Otherwise, I'd stop it, but I'm excited by the percent actually voting. And at this point, I think I will now close the poll and share the very interesting results with you guys. Here you go.
This is very interesting. Thank you, Ruben. This definitely aligns from what we see in the industry. It's across the spectrum. Where some have audited, initiated compliance remediation, that's about 30%. That's very impressive. That's the highest I've seen to date, which is a good sign. But we do see quite a spread where it's not on the audit plan. We're not sure who owns it, who's responsible for it. And a lot of them come back and say, did not even realize we had an SSH key elevated issue to worry about. So the data is perfect, and thank you for answering those questions. All right, I referred earlier the dark side, and this is why we call the SSH keys the dark side. It's a ticking bomb. I mentioned it was invented in the mid-90s, and is propagating into all production environments of all types since then. So it's everywhere. It's a critical component of any of the key controls you can think of. It's a critical component of your logical access controls, especially the ones having to do with adding, changing, or removing users. It's a critical component of your privileged access control because it's privileged in nature, it's root level, you have elevated access, but it doesn't follow any of the privileged access controls that are required to have an effective such control. Third-party access, it's used commonly for third-party access. So in my opinion, the sooner than later that we monitor, control, audit, and control that type of connectivity into our environment is a plus. It has major impact across all critical frameworks. So it doesn't matter what framework you have to comply with, PCI, SOX, Monetary Authority of Singapore, you name it, HIPAA, it does come into play when we're talking access controls across all of those. And then the ownership and responsibility are not clearly defined. Every time I ask that question, there's a dull look, people look at me and say, I'm not sure where to go with assigning ownership for this. And if you think about a potential breach, this is an encrypted tunnel, a highly encrypted tunnel. So somebody comes in as root and they have the malicious intent and they did what they did in that encrypted session that you're not logging or auditing. What kind of evidence do you think you will hand over to your investigators when you're investigating a breach? It will be a very hard breach to go through. This is hence why we call it the dark side. With that said, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Ed, who is going to take it over and talk about the recently released SSH Practitioner Considerations Guidance.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Fouad. And thank you all for making time to join us today. So I will, I will warn you that we're going to go at a little bit of a brisk pace here because of the fact that we do have this guidance that we put together with SSH, which we're very excited about. It has been a fantastic reception to this guidance so far. Just to kind of quick, set the landscape. I've been working with Fouad now on this guidance for, as you might imagine, quite a while, and I just found out this morning that I've been pronouncing his name incorrectly the whole time. so now I know better. So anyway, so let's kind of talk about what this guidance is. So ISACA and SSH put out this guidance in September. It's basically, we wanted to make sure that we were getting something that was industry agnostic, that was, that was appropriate, that was good, that was comprehensive. So it was a joint development effort supported by, by them, leveraging as well the ISACA volunteer community just to put out, the best guidance that we're able to. From our point of view, it's really kind of need-to-know information. It specifically touches on audit and assurance, which is an area that for SSH has kind of been a little challenging, shall we say, in the past. So we tried to hit that as hard as possible. And then, you know, as well as with a lot of the guidance we put out, it includes practitioner impact, suggested controls, and so forth. There's a couple of features within the document that I'm going to walk through, but I did just want to give you kind of a prelude of that guidance. So the first thing, I think Fouad did a great job making this point, but the thing that I think it's important as we go through this to realize is that, you know, in practice, SSH really is very much like plumbing. So, you know, if everything's working appropriately and, you know, your plumbing is not busted, shall we say, you know, it's something that you don't really, you know, kind of think about too hard, right? If it should be, you know, an issue should arise, well, obviously, you know, number one, it can be catastrophic, right? Just imagine if you've ever had a plumbing leak in your house, you'll know what I'm talking about. You know, but it can be catastrophic should it go awry, and also, you know, something that you know, that's pretty much everywhere within you know, within a home, or in the case of SSH within your organization. You know, when you stop to think about, you know, again, some of the what could go wrong. I love this picture here, but not to imply that folks are you know, using SSH incorrectly in the field, but hey, guess what? If you actually go out and look at what some folks are doing, there are some issues with using SSH in the field. So anyway, you know, used for everything, as Fouad mentioned, from batch processing to file transfer to sys administration, you know, all while being largely underneath the radar. So that's kind of why we thought we needed to have a guidance. You know, in terms of what that guidance actually says, I'm going to kind of walk through at a high level with you, you know, just so that, you know, folks are kind of aware of, you know, what it says. I do encourage you to go read it. You can get it from the ISACA website. You can get it from the SSH Communication Security website. It is out there, freely available. It is, you know, it is good stuff. So in terms of what it actually says from a methodology standpoint, if you kind of picture in your mind the SSH cycle, the PDCA, you know, folks who are familiar with ISO 27001 will recognize this immediately. You know, it really kind of tries to hit on, you know, things that you can do at kind of all four steps in terms of your SSH key management specifically, and also your kind of SS key usage more generally. So it talks about, you know, things like, you know, key usage, talks about question of identity, login, compliance, and so forth. So, you know, specifically, you know, what are some of the things that folks are not asking, right? I mean, there's a number of issues that we see in the field, you know, related to things like, you know, root account use, logging, key storage, and so on. I don't want to belabor these too much because I think Fouad did a, you know, fantastic job of kind of walking through things from an issue standpoint. So just in the interests of brevity, or I'll move us along, to give kind of a flyover of what the guidance is. Now, I do want to call out, I'm going to touch on each of the areas that are mentioned in the guidance, but if you actually go and take a look at it, you'll see that it tries to be practical in terms of, you know, what to do. It's got an overview of specific control areas. It's got some suggestions about what the controls could or should be, but then also it has some guidance both about implementation and then also more, maybe more directly in terms of what's needed in the field, assessment of those areas. You know, again, a lot of times when we do these, these practitioner overviews, we try to keep it, you know, practitioner agnostic, so address, you know, governance, security, risk, and all the different constituencies that we service. In this particular case, I will warn you, it's a little bit kind of oriented toward assurance. So really, you know, there's a couple of different things that we try to touch on. The first one is kind of usage procedures, right? So this is basically talking about having some kind of written guidance, whether it's a policy, whether that's a, you know, technical specification, whether it's a process or procedure, whatever it is, but basically something that is governing the use of SSH within an organization kind of at a high level. Now that includes both use of administrative privilege, obviously, like the root account, right? But it also includes things like hardening, access requirements, and it basically talks about some specific actions that you can look at. The ones that I think are kind of most helpful, obviously the policy thing is important, but having the documented procedures is important. But the one thing that I do think is kind of the reason why it's first in the list is periodic review of that to make sure that everything is appropriately and accurately codified, and that the procedures are in fact in place. So that's kind of the first one. Second one, configuration management. This is a big deal, right? When you actually go out and look at how SSH is configured in the field, I mean, anybody who's actually tried to do it knows that well, number one, you have to configure the daemon, the SSH server side differently from the client side, right? So there's configuration parameters to know for each, both of which have security implications and as well assurance implications. And this, we've just picked a high-level subset of the number of issues, things to look at, right? Are you allowing port forwarding? Are you allowing agent forwarding? Does it operate within a jail file system? What port is it running on? How much does it log, et cetera, et cetera? Whether or not root can log in remotely, and so on. So really a number of issues. We talked about, in terms of specific how-tos. The one I'd highlight here is the automated configuration management piece. I think that's really important. If there's a way that you can automate the configuration management, that's superhumanly helpful. If not, at least have a documented configuration. There's some helpful guidance out there, which Fouad is going to, give you a little bit more detail about in just a moment, specifically from NIST. But but hopefully ours is helpful as well. In addition to that, from a configuration standpoint. Okay, so next one is accountability, right? So we talked about SSH being like plumbing a little bit, which is great. But when you actually talk about ownership, because by virtue of it being kind of a little bit invisible or transparent or what have you, a lot of times there's not actually a specific group that is explicitly assigned for the purpose of maintaining SSH, right? Both from a maintenance standpoint, keeping it updated, making sure it's configured appropriately, and so on. The bigger one, I think, though, is the key management side of things, right? So unless you've taken effort to have a specific key inventory, chances are good that there's a lot of keys out there that you don't know about, or that it's being used in ways that you don't expect. So if you assign a group to specifically oversee SSH within the organization and the usage, that can be a very helpful thing as well. Okay, deployment. I happen to love this picture. I'll just call your attention to it as we go through, which is that obviously this dog, it says it's good with children and it's well mannered and whatnot, but maybe that's a little bit more complicated than you might think based on the picture, right? But this is kind of like the case with, I think it's a good metaphor for SSH deployment, because SSH comes with everything, right? It's built into most modern Linux distributions. It's on most cloud providers. I used to work for a cloud provider, as Ruben alluded to at the beginning of this. So I can tell you, even if you may not install it, a lot of times your cloud provider will. So even if you don't know about it, it's probably there somewhere. So really, from a deployment standpoint, there's a number of issues to consider. The ones that I'll call out to you is again related to the automated deployment. Talking about how you restrict those services, specifically protocol settings. So SSH v1, right? If you're using that, you may want to consider going in there and tweaking the configuration settings. A lot of people don't know this, but you can also configure, with pretty much any implementation, you can configure the cipher configuration. So you can say, like, for example, if you work in a federal information or federal agency, you can say, well, hey, I only wanted to use FIPS approved mode and not not whatever other kind of mode. These are changes and tweaks that you can make, as well as restrictions on how and where the key can be used and so forth. So if you haven't explicitly looked at it, you absolutely should, and that we try to call out some specific ways that you can do that within there. Okay, so we're moving along at a good clip, and that's, we want to get to your questions. So apologies if I'm talking fast, but we want to make sure that we have a chance to get to questions at the end. So next one we think you should look at is provisioning, explicit provisioning. So this is basically like, how are you both enabling new SSH users, and then also how are you taking away access from those users when they leave, right? So an SSH key, as a lot of folks know, is something that, is highly portable for good reason in a lot of cases, right? Because it's helpful to be able to distribute that and rapidly enable new connections. But that also means that from an administrator point of view, you want to keep an eye on how and where they can go. So some things to keep in mind: key inventory. I happen to think is a really good idea, and discovery. The key inventory piece is for those organizations that have PCI DSS in their scope. This is actually something that speaks to a specific requirement. If you go and look under 3.4 within PCI DSS, you will find that that having a list of those folks with access to keys that impact cardholder information, is advantageous, or from a regulatory standpoint. There's also some other things to consider. If you want to go to the length of actually purchasing an HSM, that's a hardware security module used for the purposes of storing keys. That's something that you can do. I don't know that every environment needs that. I will tell you the guidance touches on it, but doesn't go into a lot of detail about how to do that. But it's a helpful thing to at least have kind of your planning on your planning radar as you do the threat modeling. Okay, last one, governance, which is really kind of an umbrella area for incorporating SSH into kind of your broader risk management portfolio. So basically, as you're doing your risk management, risk analysis, you want to make sure you're addressing SSH specifically in that. I happen to, for those folks who are doing application threat modeling, I happen to like to specifically evaluate and consider it at that point as well. You don't have to do that. Obviously, the guidance doesn't touch on that. That's just something that I found valuable. But again, we talk about some of these things in that guidance as well. So definitely take a look at it and pay attention to make sure both compliance as well as your broader risk management goals are met. And then the last thing that I want to tell you about before turning it back to Fouad to talk about some of the other industry areas as well is that we do also have, in addition to this guidance that we have with that we put together with SSH Communication Security, we do also have an SSH Audit Program. It's basically specifically for the auditor, whereas the Practitioner Considerations is kind of written for both security and audit professionals. The audit program is really kind of more focused at the auditor. So this is actually like specific controls and testing steps, kind of in checklist style format. You'll find that a lot of the areas of a lot of the specific controls and guidance overlaps. That's of course by design. But this one really kind of focuses more on the testing steps as opposed to kind of giving you the written narrative. So the SSH Audit Program that is available, I will warn you, it's free to ISACA members. I think there may be some nominal charge if you're not an ISACA member. So definitely bear that in mind. But with that, I will turn it over back to Fouad so we can talk about
NIST. Thank you very much, Ed.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And yes, I agree. We had a pleasurable few months of work to get this done, but you and I see the great benefit already from this being deployed. We love the fact that auditors actually have a tool now that they go in there and follow the certain steps to make sure that the controls are in place and be able to leverage this tool to find out where the keys are, what risks are associated with poorly managed environments, and hopefully give them some recommendations to mitigate those risks. Along with the work that we have done, of course, with ISACA, we also work with NIST, and NIST says about 1.5 to 2 years ago, we rolled out NIST IR 7966. And the primary contributor from our organization was Tati Yolonen, who was the founder of our organization. Also, he is the inventor of the protocol. So in the fall of 2015, he worked with NIST and developed the security of an interactive and automated access management using Secure Shell. It's a great IR. It goes to the background and a good understanding of SSH keys. And then it takes it a step further and talks about vulnerabilities and talks about risks associated with these vulnerabilities. And of course, like any NIST documentation, it provides you best practice implementations to fix the problem. So the combination of the guidance from ISACA and the NIST and the best practice publications we continue to offer at SSH Communication Security is going to be an excellent resource for you to put this under control.
Yeah, actually, just one thing to note for folks who might not be familiar, we should probably just mention to you, IR stands for Interagency Report. Sometimes you'll hear that pronounced NISTer. It's different from a special publication in that interagency reports tend to be more technical. They're also a little bit more specific in terms of what they lay out, as opposed to, say, special publication, which might be longer, but probably less technically specific.
Thank you. All right, so the NIST IR 7966 highlights the following vulnerabilities that I'd like to mention. It talks about your SSH implementations are vulnerable, especially when you don't have the proper deployments, proper controls, and configuration. Then as a whole, when you look at a big picture for your implementation, that entire environment would be vulnerable. In addition, any improperly configured access control would be a huge vulnerability to tackle from a NIST perspective. Stolen, leaked, and unterminated SSH user keys is a huge vulnerability in such environments. You look at backdoors, because this definitely opens a back door, especially when you come in from an unknown source as root level, then you have access to the kingdom. Unintended usage of user keys. And of course, the lack of knowledge and human error is a huge vulnerability that's adding to the issues resulting from poorly managed SSH keys environments. Now, as you go take it further and look at the risks, you will notice that the risks I'm about to list are very similar to any type of account or credentials that you need to worry about within your environment. The risk associated with poorly managed SSH key environments has to come with employees who transferred out of or left our organization, and their keys are left behind live and ready to use. Lack of segregation of duties. If you recall that spider web I drew earlier or showed you earlier, that definitely shows a lack of segregation of duties control. Leftover unneeded keys. In one instance, we found out there was a key that is about 20 years old and still active and usable. Of course, it may lead to audit findings and exceptions, especially now that auditors have a tool in their hand and they are capable of issuing findings and exceptions depending on what they're looking at and what they find. And we have the human error aspect. That is always an unfortunate thing that happens in our world, but that comes also with a risk having to do with SSH keys. And then, of course, last but not least, is a lack of visibility of trust relationships. Because if you recall that spider web, SSH keys is designed in a way where it provides you a trust relationship topology that shows you all authorized access coming in from known sources, encrypted, logged, audited, coming to the designated nothing more production environment. When it's poorly managed, unconfigured, then that trust relationship is gone. So if I were to categorize what would constitute a perfect key, and this is again picking on some of the words in the NIST IR, it has to have a proven algorithm. A key must have the proven algorithm, recognized algorithm for encryption. There has to be some strict maximum on the age of your keys. You can leverage the key to restrict commands. In other words, I may grant root users access via SSH to one server to the next, but I can restrict what commands they can run on that server, strictly by properly configuring the SSH key. The key length, to make sure that it's properly protected, should be long enough, or large enough, I should say. You have the ability to put a passphrase on keys. Now, if Sony had implemented just that one aspect of a key control and put passphrases on their keys, I think the hackers would have a hard time taking control of their production environment. And authorized key source restrictions. Again, an excellent feature where you can leverage the keys to segregate from what IP address can connect to that production environment. So for PCI environments, cloud holder data, you can leverage that technology to make sure that only authorized connections are coming into your cloud holder data environment, which is great.
actually, Fouad, before you move on from this, just if it's helpful to folks, just one thing to note about this is that, you know, a lot of these, we did, you know, so in addition, we cover a lot of these issues in the guidance, right? But as a potential additional source to take a look at, if it's helpful, is about 2 months ago, we did another report that was, it's assessing cryptographic modules. So that one's also free, and it's, you know, it's a little bit more high level. So the SSH guidance speaks specifically to SSH, but a lot of the issues around like using a proven algorithm, for example, is supported by that assessing cryptographic modules, you know, document as well. So if you go, if you're going to go hunting for the SSH guidance, you know, or at least our joint guidance, and you go to the ISACA Knowledge Center, you know, again, it's, you know, we're a nonprofit, it's free, so we're not, you know, all that kind of stuff. Like it's freely available to folks out there. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it. All right, that's a great segue to our last polling question for this webinar.
Okay, excellent. So the third question that we have for today, and everyone should be able to see this, who is responsible for SSH key management within your organization? So you have a number of different departments or areas that hopefully you might be aware of that are actually managing your keys. If you could pick the one that best fits your organization, that would be great. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them listed. So we have a good number of people already voting, and we'll just keep it open for a couple more seconds here. And then I will close the poll and then share the results with everyone on the line. There you go, Fouad and Ed.
Thank you. Thank you. This is very interesting because 0% on cryptographic services. I used to see a lot more than that, so that's an interesting trend. But the breakout is very similar than what we see usually. A lot of I don't knows. It should be security, it should be Unix ops, it should be the identity and privileged access management groups. In my opinion, it's all the above. However, your current accounts and credentials are being managed, governed, controlled, and from the creation through destruction lifecycle, SSH keys should be treated the same way.
yeah.
All right, thank you.
I'm surprised. I will tell you, I expected a lot more I don't knows. So that's pretty good that folks at least know who it is.
Now, one thing I'd like to mention is a lot of times when I present this question at different conferences, recently I've been having a few people come up and say, not me. Mm. So in other words, don't bring that big monster my way, give it to somebody else. All right, moving on here. We're going to talk a little bit about best practices. Again, this is reflected in the NIST IR and other documentations that we mentioned earlier. And if you look at the remediation process and ongoing governance from a high-level perspective, as with any type of risk assessment, trying to find the loopholes or the issues within an environment, let's assess the environment. Let's find out the state of your keys. Where are they? Do you have any policies and risk identified? Where are they deployed? Have you done the inventory? Did you discover where they are? Do you know what identities are being used? Are they in compliance or are they in violation? Then you take it a step further, and then once you identify those and find them and lock them down, then you can start monitoring. How much of this activity is unauthorized, and how much of it is going to cost me findings or exceptions when an audit comes? And then it's not enough to find the issues, you gotta fix them. So remediation is key. It's recommended that you clean up all your environment, get rid of old keys, get rid of unused keys, and apply what I mentioned earlier as a perfect key, apply hardening configurations to make sure that it's better controlled, better managed. And all sums it up in one sentence, govern it. It must fall under your governance process. It cannot be ignored. It must be treated from the beginning to the end like you would do any type of other credentials within your environment. And then as a final thought, I would like to just leave you with one thing today if I could, and that is when you look at access again, when you consider your credentials into your production environment, when you consider all types of access into your production environment, that formula is incomplete unless you include your SSH keys. Because auditors up to now and I'm guilty as one in my career, I have looked at credential and access many, many times. SSH keys was not part of the formula. But I'm one of the ones that have started to learn about this. Ed and I are partnering in increasing awareness and evangelizing the fact that people need to address SSH keys. So please keep that formula in mind as you leave the webinar today, that the formula is only complete when you include all three components that I have laid out.
Absolutely true.
And with that said, it takes us now into our Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you, Ed and Fouad, for your time and for providing the necessary insight here about SSH keys and the unknown access gap that they present, as well as now the new guidance that is here for everyone to be able to use and reference. We did get a couple questions, some very technical, and I've already reached out to some of our technical experts as the company behind the protocol or created. We have some good resources to call upon. I'm going to start with some other ones, though, that I think as I'm collecting those answers still in real time, that maybe you or Ed, Fouad, you or Ed could answer. One of them that came through was, you know, and I think it might have been related to the poll, but it said, who should govern SSH keys? And I'll let you or Fouad or Ed take that one.
Sure. Excellent question. Thank you, Ruben. And it's an excellent question. And I reflected on that more than once during the presentation, and I'm glad you asked. The life cycle of keys should mimic your accounts, your credentials, anything that constitutes access within your production environment. From the point where you actually create an account, the point you assign the access, to the point it's being used, transferred, deleted, or whatever comes through, to the point it was destroyed. That process should be controlled in the same fashion. So in my opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, I think it's an enterprise-wide risk, and it should be owned as an enterprise-level risk, and the lifecycle should be governed like you would govern any type of accounts that cross across your different infrastructure and applications. Yeah,
well, you know what's interesting to me about that question is that they didn't say who should manage, right? They said who should govern, and what's interesting to me about that, because, you know, when you kind of look in practice, right, like a lot of organizations don't approach them as being two separate things, but they really are, right? And so you know, keep in mind that if you are going to go out and, you know, say, for example, right, you have an identity management or, you know, automated provisioning or whatever it is that you have in place, you know, sometimes you can automate SSH, you know, the SSH keys as part of that. Sometimes you can't, right? But either way, from a governance standpoint, you need to have the structures, the governance structures in place. You need to have some kind of monitoring and accountability. You need to have some kind of measuring instrument where you can determine if you're doing the right thing or not. So all these other things, you know, from a governance standpoint, regardless of how you choose to implement that, should be in place. So really good question.
Great, thank you. Any other questions on your end, Ruben?
Yes, so here's a real technical one. I'm going to throw it out there, and and usually we don't go this technical in these kind of sessions, but I thought since we are, quote unquote, the experts behind the protocol, we'd give it a shot. So this came from an individual that said, in my network, I've found the SSH brute force and user creation on a server, which immediately set alarms in my head when I read that. It says also SSH login from the remote IP, but cannot trace how the user has been created. What type of vulnerability is being used? And in this case of Ubuntu 12.04, what should I do? So immediately I was thinking, well, I don't know if this is really down Ed and Fouad's street here.
Oh,
so
hey, I'll take it out.
If you want to take a swipe at it, and then I'll also chime in with what our sales engineers and our support people already answered with. So you go for it.
Well, no, I mean, if you have an answer after, I mean,
we'd love to hear your opinion first.
All right, here's my opinion.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so my opinion is, I mean, I think this person is right in suspecting that this could potentially be an issue, right? So absolutely flagging it. You know, I mean, you know, you might even be at the point of, you know, potentially considering triggering your incident response process. I mean, so they said they're using Ubuntu, which means, you know, fortunately being that they're in a Linux environment, right? You know, there are some pretty good, you know, tools there, you know, in terms of, you know, examining whether or not there's a potential, you know, backdoor or whatever. But honestly, like my gut is I would, if it's at all feasible, I would sequester that system. I would quarantine it. I would, you know, initiate the incident response process. I mean, if somebody's actively on it, brute forcing, and they don't know, how that's occurring from where or why, I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
Great answer.
Right. So I got similar answers from our tech folks, and this was in real time, so I love being able to do this. Immediately, support said, well, if you're using Ubuntu, you should refer to their website, and we recommend that you patch anything that Ubuntu recommends immediately. And then the user that created, it could be an attacker, for example, gained access to the server, but also could have been created in some other way outside of an SSH connection. So that's something you want to be concerned with. So going right to what you said, Ed, this could be a pretty significant incident. You want to start locking these things down, and that's what our support people said too. They said to avoid brute force attacks and to isolate as much as possible, enforce MFA and or disable password auth, disable remote root login, and start using tools like sudo, S-U-D-O, and to elevate permissions. So
yeah, I mean, sort of.
No, so I mean, what we say in this kind of question, I think is, I don't envy this particular attendee's position they're in, but this highlights kind of what this whole webinar is about. And I think you and Fouad can, speak to that in essence, if you don't know where these things are, or you don't know how old they are, you don't know the access they have, you might want to consider trying to find ways to, right now it's a fire, right now we get that, but, bigger picture for the audience, how you then maybe are able to do an assessment or get control, or at least start to get visibility to your keys. And that's me talking, but I would like to hear you guys talk in terms of that, given what now this poor individual is facing.
Yeah, I mean, just one real quick thing, just to kind of, so absolutely, I mean, we can follow up on, and so on, but just one real quick thing to close this out. The answer that I gave earlier was, my assumption there was reading into the question that they are on that box, actively, actively doing the brute force, like so that they've already gained access. If they're coming from some external host, for example, and doing the brute force against SSH, like, over the network, then, I mean, you probably don't want to necessarily pull the box offline in that case. I just wanted to clarify that.
Right. That makes sense, yes. So I think there's another question that is, I think, a good segue to what now has been discussed, and we still have a few minutes here. This question says, what are some strategies for locating SSH usage in my environment, and what techniques or tools can I use to discover where SSH keys are used? Question mark. I'll let either of you two jump on that one.
Yeah, there's a few different strategies, right? I mean, I'll tell you the non-technical one first, right? And then I think it's, kind of a good tee up to you all, right? Because if I remember correctly, you guys have a product that does that, right?
Yes, we do.
So the non-technical one, right, is that what I like to do a lot of times is I'll include it in a business impact assessment. So like if I have a BCP DR activity that's going on, like if, I need to do a BIA as part of that, right? Or if I'm at a hospital or health center or whatever, and I know that I have a regulatory requirement to do that BIA, what I'll tend to do is I'll ask questions in the BIA as part of that process, where I'll look for SSH either from a process standpoint, right, like an administrator who's using it, or if I'm called on to actually sample that host for some other reason, like so say for example PCI assessment, if I'm in a merchant or retail environment, then I'll do a quick like which SSH, right, or find dash name slash find slash dash name, you know what I mean, right? Looking for SSHD on that box, or SSH, or various different flavors of it. So, but again, that's kind of the non-technical approach. But
you started, this is exactly how it works, and there's a lot of methods for finding these keys, discovering these keys. We have ways where we've helped customers currently, where we give them their tools to enable themselves to go out there and leverage these scripts to find out where these keys are. And the number one thing to do is to find out, go out there, where are they? Locate them, then lock them down, and lock them down under a root account that you have control over, not a root account that you can SSH into. Mm-hmm. And then that will be the first step. And then if you recall the previous slide I put up where it talks about best practice, then you start identifying which ones are authorized, which ones are in violation of the policy, what identities are they leveraging, and then as this list continues to grow, then you start remediating and closing the ones that should not be connected, should not be running wild in your environment. And that process does take some time, and primarily it only takes time because most organizations are worried about breaking something down or causing some issue to a critical process that's running, just to make sure that everything stays up and running and the 99.99% availability they all want to achieve.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you both. And to that end, we do offer a risk assessment to anybody. And for the individual on the phone, if you'd like to reach out to us, or we can even reach out to you to understand that better, Fouad referenced that, we're actually here to help. And that's the first step in the process. So with that, we're now at the top of the hour for this particular webinar, and I wanted to thank you, Ed, and Fouad again for your time. And, thank everyone else for taking time to attend the webinar today. And we hope you've been able to gain insights into how you can better manage your most trusted access and encrypted traffic that is, made available by SSH keys. Now, the trick, of course, is trying to get those under control. And if you'd like to learn more, please visit SSH.com or follow us on Twitter by following our handle @SSH. Thank you once again, and this will now conclude this webinar.